Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. And I rise to oppose the Business Services Wage Assessment Tool Payment Scheme Bill 2014 unless the amendments that Labor has put forward, the very sensible amendments, can be agreed to today. And it is a shame, and it's that shame is the Abbott government's shame, that we can't stand here today and have bipartisan agreement on an issue which is so important. But it seems, as we've stood many times as an opposition opposing the harsh, cruel measures of the Abbott government, that anyone in our society who needs a little bit more support or a little bit more consideration, that support and consideration is simply not given by the Abbott government. Their agenda is to seemingly say to our community as a whole, you're on your own, it's up to you, make your own way, because we are not there to provide that additional support that groups may require. Because all the heavy lifting on issues around people with disability has been done by Labor. And we had bipartisan support then, as we've seen in aged care, NDIS in childcare and a whole range of other areas. The Abbott government is simply seeking to undo some fundamental principles around helping those in our community who need that additional support. And in speaking to this bill this morning, I looked back at our recent history in this area of people with disability generally. And it is true to say that in the past, and I hope we're long past this, people with disability have been ignored, they've been hidden, they've been locked away in asylums and other specialist institutions. And if we look even further back in history, people with disability have been subjected to public ridicule through appearances at circuses and the like. A shameful history, Mr Acting Deputy President, which of course has left its mark. And our most recent pass is to see those people with disability as a problem which society has to deal with. And we did that by placing people in institutions and or prisons, and by the appalling practice of sterilising women and girls. And I sincerely hope, as a society, we are long past that culture, those practices and those beliefs. And looking at Australia's history, there have been some major milestones. And the first of those was in 1908, when the Australian government introduced the invalid pension, which of course increased the independence of people with disability, as well as provided them with acknowledgement to some extent as recognised members of society. And that's from the website of the People with Disability, who provide a really good history of people with disability in Australia. And then our involvement in World Wars I and II, and indeed the Vietnam War, forced Australian society to be more inclusive as people came back with injuries which prohibited them from participating in their communities in the way they did before, and indeed people came back with intellectual impairment as well. And so it forced us to recognise that people with disability had the right to live a decent life and be properly supported to lead that decent life. Because just saying people have a right to live a decent life without putting in the underpinning supports is paying lip service. It's talking the talk, it's not walking the walk. If I can turn now to the particular bill before us, the Australian Disability Enterprises are of course a commercial business, and they employ people with disability who need support to stay in paid work. And we all know that enabling decent employment, respectful employment, assists everyone in our community, and people with disability are no different. They are in exactly the same way that work enables them to participate more fully in community life, as indeed it does for all Australians who seek work. There are almost 200 Australian disability enterprises across Australia, and they support 20,000 people with disability, and I think the recent stats is about 500,000 Australians who have some sort of disability living in our communities. And Labor believes, and not only do we believe, but we have a strong and proud record, that more needs to be done to support people with disability into employment, which is why Labor introduced the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and that is the most significant reform to disability services in this country's history. It will become the Medicare of the future. It is something that should be above party politics and should be supported by every single Member of Parliament and Senator in this place. But of course, that savage Abbott government budget continues to wreak havoc on all sections of the Australian community. And we see in the 2014-15 budget, it's full of savage cuts to people with disability. And I know that the government will try and play that down and deny it and say it's putting more money in, but the facts are that it is full of cuts to people with disability. To people with disability, their families and their carers have been abandoned by the Abbott government. And the coalition government have a history of this. When they were last in government, the value of Commonwealth funding for disability services was cut repeatedly and dramatically. They capped the number of disability employment assistance places. I mean, why as a government would you deny people with disability the opportunity to work? But that's what happened as a result of their capping, meaning that many people simply missed out, fell on the scrap heap and were denied that opportunity to make a meaningful contribution, good to society and good to them as individuals. Like Labor did in aged care, like Labor did in schools, Labor has done the heavy lifting to repair this. And we've invested, and we did invest $3.2 billion, and to uncap those disability employment assistant places. And as a result of that, around 160,000 disability employment service participants with disability found work. And let's look at the bill, which will establish a payment scheme for supported employees with intellectual disability in Australian disability enterprises who previously had their wages assessed under the Business Services Wage Assessment Tool, which was developed in 2003. And it will determine the wages of about half of all workers in the Australian disability enterprises. But both the Federal and the High Court, the Federal and the High Courts of Australia, have determined independently that the Business Service Wage Assessment Tool has discriminated against some people with intellectual disability. And when that decision came down, I heard people with disability being interviewed and I was appalled at how little they earned, because that wage would have made no contribution to their well-being from both the work that they did, failure to recognise the value of their work, and also to enable them to lead independent lives. And that decision found that a supported employee with an intellectual disability may never be able to meet the competency component, never be able to meet it set too high, which is measured by that tool. And of course we know that further representative proceedings are in train. But this means that these Australian workers, some of the most vulnerable in our community, have been paid less than they should have. And to hear their stories was quite appalling. And when listening to those stories, Australians who believe in the well-being of all Australians, as I am, should be ashamed to hear those stories. And I was appalled to hear the sorts of wages that they were receiving, certainly not wages anyone could live on. And of course this issue is a complex one. And the government tells us the idea of the scheme is to provide some reassurance to supported employees and their families and carers. And of course that's a good thing. We should be providing a reassurance, and Labor supports that reassurance. But Labor cannot and won't support this bill in its current form. It goes back to the old days when people with disability were locked away, the old days when they weren't respected, the old days when the value of the work they provide to our communities wasn't acknowledged. And the government wants to just push this through the Senate without consultation with key stakeholders. We're way beyond that in this area. We do need the input of stakeholders. That's how we can inform ourselves correctly. That's how we can make good decisions. When governments make decisions in isolation without any consultation with expert groups and stakeholders, we get these mean-spirited decisions which actually will make life harder and will treat people with disability trying to make a living in the most harsh way. That's what happens when governments make decisions in isolations. So back to the old days, the bad old days when government knows best, no consultation with stakeholders, we'll tell you what's good for you. I thought we were long past that. Certainly Labor is long past that kind of approach. And that's why we called for the Senate inquiry. It's why Labor insisted there be a Senate inquiry. And that was to give stakeholders some opportunity to give their evidence to government. And of course, as we know, the inquiry raised some real concerns with the bill. And Labor senators on the committee expressed very serious reservations and very serious concerns that the bill effectively extinguishes a person's legal right. So that bill takes us right back to before 1908, when we first had the invalid pension. We're saying to people with disability, we know what's best for you. To extinguish someone's rights, their legal rights, is something that Labor senators will not stand for. The bill stipulates that a person ceases to be a group member of any relevant representative proceeding at the time the acceptance of a payment under the scheme is lodged. Labor cannot support provisions in the bill that it seeks to extinguish a person's right to pursue compensation through the courts. It is extinguishing the rights, whether you have a disability or not, whether you have a physical disability or an intellectual disability. We should not, as a parliament, be extinguishing anyone's rights to proceed to legal action if they believe it is in their best interest to do so. And for the government to put in to the bill provisions that do that just shows that it's a patronising attempt. It's just saying to people with disability, we're back to the old days, we'll tell you what's good for you, and by the way, we're not going to allow you to appeal your rights. And we've seen other legislation where the government has done similar sorts of things. This is a government who thinks it knows best, who's patronising to a number of groups in our community, and today the target is people with disability. Labor's determined to see workers with a disability receive fair pay, and we are determined to make sure they retain their legal rights as an absolute minimum. And Labor stands here today to urge the government to get on with the very important job of developing a new wage assessment process, one that doesn't discriminate against anyone with any type of disability, a fair instrument, and further to not extinguish legal rights that workers have. And in giving evidence to the current Senate inquiry, People with Disability Australia argued that, and I quote, "The bill is a clear attempt on behalf of the Commonwealth to avoid implementation of the Nugent and Pryor judgment and to sabotage the current representative action for compensation by people with intellectual disability who experience discrimination as a result of having their wage assessed using the BSWAT. In doing so, the bill will exploit the vulnerable circumstances of people with intellectual disability who, with ADES, by providing a payment in exchange for their consent to maintain a system of wage determination which has proven to discriminate against them." I mean, this from one of the stakeholders, this absolutely clear assessment of what the government's bill will do to people with disability, particularly those with intellectual disability, would have been completely missing this rich evidence if we had not had a Senate inquiry, because the government, again, simply failed to consult with those who are advocates in our system. Just that failure to advocate. And why? Because they knew, I can only presume, that this is exactly what would happen, and they did not want this evidence on the public record. That would be the only reason you would not consult with stakeholders. Didn't want to create a fuss, thought they could slip this in through the back door. We've seen them do it in a whole range of other areas of trying to avoid the scrutiny of the parliament, to try and avoid the scrutiny of the work of the Senate in the committee. And here we have a real live example of exactly why the government wants to do that, because their bill absolutely categorically seeks to extinguish the legal rights of workers with an intellectual disability, and not only that, it wants to keep their pay as low as possible. Who knows why? Maybe they think that these commercial enterprises should make a big profit off the backs of people with disability, and if they make a profit, good on them. But in the meantime, let's pay people fairly and use a tool that's independent, that's fair, that absolutely adequately and properly assesses somebody's ability to work. But no, government knows best. It's out there saying this is the way we will move forward. Well, Labor's not going to support that unless our amendments are absolutely considered and taken on board by the government. And Labor senators of the committee recommended that the provisions of the bill, which seeks to extinguish a person's right to pursue compensation through the courts, be rejected. I mean, that is at the essence here of what the government is trying to do, extinguish someone's rights. I mean, what sort of government would do that? Who is advising the government that this is a good course of action? It is not. And where does it stop? We extinguish the rights here. Who's the next group to have their rights extinguished? No, the government might think it might be able to get on with its harsh, cruel agenda more freely if it was able to just extinguish rights here, there and not allow anyone the right of appeal. But I can absolutely assure you Labor will not stand by and allow any workers or any people to have their rights extinguished in this harsh, cruel way. And to not have a tool that properly assesses somebody's competencies, which will lead to a decent and a fair pay, is quite disgraceful. Quite disgraceful. We're going back to the old days when people with disability were not respected. And of course, we're also very concerned by any rules that do not ensure nominee provisions are used as a last resort. The nominee rules under the NDIS Act are underpinned by principles of supported decision-making and underpinned by the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Labor signed up to in 2008. And certainly Labor remains very concerned that nominee provisions in this bill are not premised on this principle of supported decision-making. And the Human Rights Committee has sought advice from the Minister as to whether the decision-making models in place are compatible with the rights to equality and non-discrimination. And Labor urges the government to publish the proposed rules as soon as possible and undertake extensive consultation on them to ensure they're consistent with the principle of supported decision-making, consistent with the NDIS, which they claim they are signed up to. So to extinguish someone's rights and to not pay a fair wage is neither are principles which Labor will support. And I'm saying to the government today, take our amendment seriously, otherwise we can't support this bill. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President.